I'm here with James Caesar, professor of politics at the University of Virginia, where he's taught since 1976. James is the author of 15 books on American politics, including his most recent, After Hope and Change, the 2012 Elections in American Politics. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me start with a big picture question about civic education. Should civic education be part of higher education, and what part should it be?
Well, civic education is a broad term, and unfortunately to some it has a bad reputation, at least for higher education. Civic education, let's say at the elementary school level or the middle school, can mean, as properly so, that you inculcate a partiality towards America, which I think is a good thing. But when it comes to higher education, if you take that same idea, some people object to that and say that the purpose of higher education is not to inculcate, but always to question and criticize and analyze. And I think that there's something to that, so that the term civic education probably is not the perfect term when we're speaking of higher education. Still, there's a purpose for learning about one's country, its principles, and I suppose if we speak of civic education at the university level, it means doing so to teach a sympathetic appreciation, but by no means to inculcate an idolatry. So higher education is always the questioning of things. What's done, therefore, in a course in civic education at the university level is to present, as I said, to present in a way that at least you begin with sympathetic appreciation, but then to analyze, criticize, question, and allow students and professors free thought about the subject.
You've taken as a model for this the Rockfish Gap Report that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson wrote. Tell us about that.
The report was written in 1818 before the University of Virginia was actually established. The idea had been accepted by the legislature, and this was a document that this group presented to the legislature to explain the purpose of the university. So it's about really the establishment of the University of Virginia. And even broader than that, it fits into the whole scheme of education for the state of Virginia. It's a remarkable report. In the course of it, they discussed this question of what we've been calling civic training or civic education. They assign the portion of it that belongs to primary education, and then they move on to higher education, what would be done at the University of Virginia. And in that context, they begin to speak of the importance for students of the University of Virginia to understand the principles of free government, and then understand, as is also the case with many of our state universities, that a large number of the governors, statesmen, and judges of the state will be coming out of that institution. So part of the purpose of education, therefore, is to prepare people for those positions. So citizenship generally, most of which is taken care of at the earlier level, citizenship and preparation for specialized positions in government. Later on, after the university was underway, Madison and Jefferson presented an idea of a curriculum for a course in politics, which would then be at the law school. And it's there that they went into more depth of what sort of documents would be looked at, what sort of curriculum would be devised. And they suggested in that particular letter and report that students would learn the principles of free government, that they would study the classics in that vein, John Locke, Sidney, and then some American texts in particular, the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson is credited as being the author, the Federalist Papers, Madison was the principal author, Washington's Farewell Address, and a couple of other things, including a report of the Virginia legislature in a way protesting the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is a long document which James Madison pretty much wrote. So they assigned some of their own stuff, as professors are apt to do, but they are the classic documents, and they wanted students to be imbued in the understanding of general principles of liberty and the foundations of American constitutionalism.
Would you add to the recommendations or take anything away from what they recommended?
Well, I'd certainly add today, those documents were appropriate for the time, dealing with the American founding. there is a question, in a more general question of politics, whether other principles would be explored through other political philosophers, and they by no means meant to exclude those from a curriculum of education, but to go back and speak of some of the classics, and they were certainly open to that. And of course, today we have to take into account what's happened since the era in which they lived, as they would do if they were here today.
You've tried to do this a little bit at the University of Virginia through an American political tradition class. What do you do with that class?
Exactly. In some ways, it's modeled after the ideas of Jefferson and Madison about what a course should do. So in this course that we teach, it begins by discussing the principles of free government. In fact, begins by contrasting those with other systems where that's not the principle, and that's always a good way to learn, to say what a thing is not, to help you understand what it is. So we read some of the very texts that Jefferson and Madison outlined and spent a good deal of time on that. Of course, since the country's been going many, many years, over 2 centuries since then, we add all the parts of the American tradition since then, and the dialogues and disputes as part of the material that the students look at. So, for example, classic documents that we look at, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, some of the speeches of the progressive presidents of Franklin Roosevelt, civil rights debates, all of the parts of American history and development which bear upon first principles. So I like to say that we work in the spirit of that original curricular proposal of Jefferson and Madison.
What's the ideal setting for a class like this in terms of size and format?
Well, the ideal setting, I think, if possible in teaching politics, is to allow for discussion, because politics in a way begins from people having different opinions about things, even the material that they read. And the opportunity to be able to first understand what a text means, but then debate it and allow students to express their views is the perfect setting if you can get it. And therefore, in this particular course, the resources given to it are extensive. It's taught in a seminar setting with no more than 20 students in each class. And that's the formula that we've used. And I think the students enjoy the opportunity right at the beginning of their university period to be able to discuss things intimately with each other and a professor, and to debate these things openly.
If we think about this class and some of the trends in higher education today, one of those trends is a push toward using innovative technology, including online classes and online components. Is there a way to blend this kind of traditional model of education with some of the new technologies?
Well, I think there is. There's many ways of teaching courses, and one thing to remember in a university education is one course is only part of one's education. So different courses can serve different functions. As I said, in this class, there's a great deal of attention paid to these fundamental documents and arguments, and it's done in discussion, but there's no reason why the same material could not be presented through lectures and readings in which students might have the opportunity only to participate, say, one time in a week out of 3 sessions, so 2 lectures and a discussion section. It might not be the perfect opportunity to be educated, but it can be a very healthy one, especially if the lectures are well done and the professor's sensitive to the purpose of the course. And I think at the end of the day, what really counts is the quality of the educational experience. You can have good discussion sections, you can have bad discussion sections. You can have good lectures, and you can have lectures where you'd prefer to be, if you have the opportunity, emailing one of your friends.
Sure. Jim, you teach in a politics department at UVA, and you teach about the American founding, and you do it from the perspective of political science. And you've described in your work the American founding as the product of political science in some ways. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, first in a literal sense, if you look at the establishment of most countries, at their origins and when they write the constitutions, and ask the question, what role did political science play in it? The answer in 99.9% of the cases would be none. It could be a coup d'etat, someone taking over. It could be an accident of history which changed the form of government. Very few are the instances where you can actually go to the moment of inception and say, my gosh, texts of political science and the method of political science were fundamental to the establishment of the political order. And I think it could be argued that in a way America is the, if not the first, and it might be the first, certainly the most important instance of where this occurred. Of course, there was lots of parts of the American founding that were due to bargains, to accidents. But when you look at the establishment of the founding, we see political science playing a key role. In the first instance, in the people themselves, studying the state constitutions between 1776 and 1789, and using methods of political science, what worked and what didn't. And we see the debate of this at the Constitutional Convention, but also among the founders themselves. What were the parts of the state constitutions that in some way caused problems? What were the parts of the state constitutions that in some way could be used and changed and altered to form good government? But then in addition, and actually helping to form the state constitutions themselves, were fundamental texts of political science, the political science written by John Locke, by Montesquieu and Hume. And we know that the founders read them. We can read Madison's notes and see how fundamental these were to the establishment of the government. The texts of political science directly helped to structure the government. Or put it in the negative way, would the Constitution of the United States have been the same without those texts of political science? And the answer is clearly no.
If we understand it in this way, political science is extremely practical. It's relevant. It influenced politics in that day. Is political science still relevant?
Well, it depends on the kind of political science. It's a broad field of inquiry and has different purposes. But it is true that I think let's say the original or classical understanding of political science was that it was a body of knowledge that was at least potentially applicable to politics. It was something that could be used as a kind of advisor to those who would act in politics, with the idea that if they had this knowledge, which they still would have to apply themselves, but if they had this knowledge, there'd be a better chance that what they came up with would work better and have better results. In the same way, obviously, that we want a doctor, someone called the doctor, to have actually studied medicine. The doctor has to decide how to apply those principles of medicine to each case, since every body's different, every disease is different, everyone's physical condition is different. But the science of medicine obviously is there to help the doctor cure, and without it, I'd hate to be in any way paying for a doctor like that. So political science frequently compared itself to medicine. It's not as exact as science, but the person who had the advantage of political science would be better in advising and helping and acting within the political arena.
Some of our colleagues, I think, would look at John Locke and Montesquieu and others and their writings and think that that's something different than political science. And I think that goes to some changing conceptions of what political science is. Hamilton in the Federalist Papers talked about the new science of politics. What did Hamilton mean by that, and how have changing conceptions of political science changed how we view that?
Well, I think the new science of politics is in the vein of the classical in what it attempts to do. But the new science refers to certain discoveries that were made through the ages in political science, discoveries which Hamilton and Madison both thought improved the science, made it, say, a better and more complete science than it had been. But the purpose was still the same, to help advise those who acted in politics and those who founded or established political orders. And the new discoveries had to do with such things as representation, which wasn't known in the ancient world in quite the same way, separation of powers, and other American innovations such as federalism. These were ways of organizing government that were the product of a new era. So I think that's what Hamilton had in mind. To compare with those today, as I said, political science is a broad profession. Parts of it are concerned simply with knowledge for knowledge's sake, which I have nothing against, to be sure. But many political scientists are simply interested in being able to describe how things are, or to be able to delineate certain relations. some political science does not take place or is not undertaken with a view to advising the statesman or political actor. Now, I think it's ultimately probably a good idea to go have the classical idea in mind when one speaks of political science. To be sure, there are going to be instances where you're interested just in the research, but if you always keep in mind, how is the knowledge that I'm acquiring, how could that be used in some way to help political actors? I think you'll be closer to what's important in political science. If I were just interested in knowledge how things worked without use, I think I'd much prefer to study animals or insects than human beings. But I like in the human beings the idea that this is a science with a practical application, at least in theory, a practical application.
Your own work as a political scientist began with a study of presidential selection in 1979. What did you learn through that study, and what's changed about the way that we select presidents since then?
Well, I studied in that book, which was my doctoral dissertation, I studied how the president was selected over time in America. What were the different systems that were used to nominate and then finally to elect? Studied the changes that had taken place over American history, and it's been a system that's changed dramatically. We don't choose the president the way we once did. Not only how it changed, but why it changed, and again, going back to this idea of political science, to the extent that these changes were undertaken consciously, what purposes did people have in mind when they advocated changes in the presidential selection system? So again, political science is something which would be applicable to those who act and who shape our institutions and our world. That was the principal aim of the book. And of course, I undertook the study and came upon it because the 1970s was a period, one of the great periods of fundamental shifts in the way we chose our president. Prior to the 1970s, the institution used to nominate candidates was the political party convention. Well, we still have conventions, and they go through the exercise of nominating, but they really don't do the work of nomination. We know when the convention meets who the nominee is. That's been decided in the primaries. But earlier in American history, the convention itself was the place where the decision could be made as to who the nominee would be. And sometimes in the older conventions, there would be many, many ballots. The deliberations and horse trading would take place at the convention among the party leaders. So it's a different system now then than we have now. Post-1979, the decisions about who the nominee will be are made in open primaries, and the convention merely registers the results of those primary elections and various caucuses around the country.
You and Jeff Toulis at the University of Texas and others have referred to the modern presidency as the rhetorical presidency. What is that, and what kind of shift does that mark in the presidency?
Well, it has something to do with the way presidents are nominated today. The original idea of nominating presidents, not by conventions but through primaries, the idea of that was a product of the progressive era, very much tied to Woodrow Wilson, because what he saw is that if the nominating body agency was no longer the convention but primaries, then an important quality, an attribute in getting elected would be being able to persuade large numbers of people in a campaign, which is exactly what we have today. The candidates have to go out and they have to sell themselves, promote their ideas before mass audiences. It's nice if they can convince some party leaders, and of course they need funding from small sets, but fundamentally it's an exercise of moving and persuading large numbers of people. And what is the name for that activity? Classically it's been called, and is still called, rhetoric. Rhetoric is the science of persuasion. Mass rhetoric is the science of mass persuasion. So hence this term rhetorical presidency relating to how they were chosen. Equally, however, in Wilson's view, the character of the presidency would much more have the quality, as it does today, of trying to move large numbers of people over the heads of Congress, to win public opinion as a way partly of governing. Of course, that's always been a concern of presidents. There should be no misunderstanding. But it's also true that previous to Wilson, I think presidents saw themselves more often having to deal with Congress. Today, we frequently have the president going over the heads of Congress, trying to persuade public opinion. In fact, many of the days of the presidency are spent in what's called campaigning. The president spends much of his time campaigning, not for office anymore, but campaigning for his proposals by giving speeches that resemble in some way campaign speeches. So mass rhetoric, or popular rhetoric, is an important part of the office. And the attributes of mass rhetoric, which is not just the speech of the president, but advertising in the campaign ads, advertising techniques, public opinion polling, the science, you could say, of persuasion is at the center of the office of the presidency today.
So you got into this studying presidential selection, 1970s. Your most recent book is about the 2012 elections. What lessons have we learned from those elections?
Well, the most important thing that one learns in an election has to do with the politics of that election itself. And 2012 is an interesting election, perhaps not as interesting as 2008, which was an extraordinary election which brought a transformation of American politics in the election of Barack Obama, together with large majorities in the House and the Senate. It was one of those rare breakthrough points in American politics where one party pretty much has control over the whole government and acts a bit more like a parliamentary party in that it can impose its will upon the country. Obviously, the Republicans had some say after the 2008 election, but major pieces of legislation were passed over the heads of Republicans with no Republican votes, including the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. In 2010, there was a reaction against 2008. The Republicans made huge gains in the House, took control of the House from the Democrats, made gains in the Senate as well. The Republicans also had massive gains at the state level, capturing governorships and state legislatures. You could think of, therefore, 2010 as being an election which gave a different mandate than 2008. Some have called the 2010 election the Great Repudiation. It repudiated 2008. This set up, I think, the election of 2012, an election that had to choose between two mandates. The mandate of 2008, which was the progressive mandate of Obama, the mandate of 2010, which was the repudiation. 2012 was going to adjudicate between those two. Politics never stops. The day of the election is over, the politics becomes the interpretation of the election in which each side tries to impose its understanding of what the election meant. And initially, Democrats had the advantage in this. They interpreted the election as the revival of the spirit of 2008. The pressure was on from the Democrats to look at the election as signaling a new and broad agenda for the president. If you look at actually the outcomes of the election, it's not quite so clear. It was a victory, but not a huge one. The Republicans still controlled one of the major institutions, the House of Representatives. They still had a kind of popular mandate from that institution. And what we've seen since in the last year is a continuing battle between these two mandates. And here it is coming up on the next election. And what are we talking about? We're talking about yet another round in this contest. So you could say we've had the thesis, 2008, and then the different efforts to modify or change that thesis. 2010, a Republican victory. 2012, a Democratic edge. And now we're coming up again on 2014, and the Republicans think they're still holding on and that they can decide this thing in their favor with another repudiation of the 2012 election. How long this will go on in this form, I don't know, but 2014 is shaping up as a kind of repeat of 2010 and 12.
One of the themes of your scholarship has been the importance of ideas, and not just ideas in and of themselves, but ideas for their influence on politics, for understanding American politics. And you've used a phrase called foundational ideas, or what you refer to as foundational ideas. What are foundational ideas, and do they still matter?
Well, a foundational idea could be defined as a first principle of right or good, which sets the ends and objectives of the political system and the political order. That's a kind of a technical meaning. It sounds highfalutin, but think of what the Declaration of Independence was. That would be a foundation. It set forth the ends of government, and it based it upon certain principles, self-evident principles or laws of nature. So in some sense, it went back to some first idea of what's right. We know what's right by virtue of what the laws of nature are. And what's interesting in American politics at that period and since is the role played by foundational ideas. There are many countries where what makes the country has nothing to do with some first principle of theory or philosophy. It's something like your common heritage, your common sentiments, the experiences you live together. But no, in American politics, in addition to those things, something was set forth which says, this is an idea which sets forth the principle of right. The purpose of political order is to achieve these goals and aims. So that would be a foundational idea. Now, the most prominent one, the one we celebrate every July 4th, is that idea in the Declaration of Independence. But there have been challenges to this, significant challenges, other foundations which have posed different ideas of what the right would be. So those would be foundational ideas as well, such as a foundational idea that the end of political life is to promote progress. And we know what progress is as a first instance because we know where history is going. So what's good in that case becomes not what's right according to nature, but what would bring us, promote progress, bring us, move us towards progress. And what's bad would be that which retards progress or takes us back. So good and bad is redefined as progressive and retrograde. So there have been a variety of foundations that have existed in American politics. They said far more than people normally think of when they study American politics. I've looked at it from that perspective. And you can see a foundational element, maybe a vague one or an echo of it, in modern political life. Many like to continue to speak of the principles of the Declaration and the principles of nature and limited government. Others, they've taken the name progressive, are very much moved, at least by the echo of what would promote progress, and see politics more of that. In some ways that influences the principles of the two political parties. That's, I think, why I don't want to overestimate the role of ideas. There's many other influences in politics, material interests. I mean, day-to-day politics is bargaining and horse trading. But behind those are often these foundational ideas. And no more, in American history, no more important an example of that would have been the politics that took place in the 1850s and 1860s, where, as Lincoln put it, this was really the issue. What will be the foundational principle of America? Will it continue to be the principles of the Declaration, or will it be the replacement of those principles by some science, racial science, which was used to legitimate slavery? So he defined it in those terms and discussed it in those terms, and others did as well. So sometimes very clearly these foundational ideas actually become the substance of political controversy. They enter into, of all things, the campaigns for presidential office. They're articulated, maybe not in pure form, but articulated nonetheless in open political controversy.
Jim, one last question related to political science and what exactly we're studying. One theme of your work has been the importance of ideas. Another has been the importance of history. What's the relationship between political science and the study of politics and the discipline of history?
Well, first of all, I'd say history doesn't need political science to validate itself. History is as old and ancient a discipline, maybe even older than political science. And history has its own standard of what's important and why. And when you read what I consider to be some of the most interesting or best historians about the purpose of history, frankly, is to understand the past on its own terms, not try to subordinate the past to the present, not look at the past as a preparatory of what's happening now, but the value of actually understanding something on its own terms, to understand the age on its own terms, because it frequently turns out when you do an in-depth historical study, you find not that people think the way we did, but they think very differently than we did. Not that they see the world as we do, but they see it very differently. And I think historians, the best historians, are sensitive to that. They want to bring alive a world of the past. The value of that being that we take ourselves out of the present, not immerse ourselves more in the present. There's a famous British historian, Herbert Butterfield, who wrote a book about this, a small and short book, which is worth reading. But he made this point, he says, indirectly saying this: why study history if you're really just studying the present day, if you're using the past just to think in terms of the categories you use today? You get a lot more out of it if you try and understand the past as different, and then use that difference to throw some light or perspective on what we do today. So much for history. Political science is a different kind of discipline. It's, I think, tied mostly to trying to understand, let's say, laws or inferences of causality to help the political actors. Somewhat like this. If I do A, is B more likely to result? That is, if I establish, let's say, a government with separation of powers, are we more likely to have free people and free government? It's interested in those laws or inferences which could advise a political actor. So the political science, this looks at history a little bit as a predator. It's not so much interested really in the sequence of events, but takes the history as a laboratory to say, what can we find in history which would either confirm or deny a certain hypothesis? When certain thing has done, when actors have acted this way, what has been the result? So it looks at history in a different light, kind of as I said, as a laboratory. I think that's legitimate. I think it's helpful. I think there's also a danger in this. Sometimes you can lose the spirit of the past and the particularity of the past. You can flatten history. And so historians frequently object to this correctly. Political science have another advantage. They don't have to go to archives, which they never do anyhow. Occasionally they will go to the library, but historians are there all the time. Still, I think there is something to that. As long as you understand the tentative character of what political science are doing, they're using history for another purpose, a solemn, important purpose with a good end, but it's not the true character of history itself.
Jim, it was a pleasure. Thanks for sitting down and talking today.
Thank you.